Thank you for allowing me to be part of this Engage Purpose Conference. Each of you that are watching, each of you that has an opportunity or will watch it in the future, I want you to know that our network has one vision, one purpose as the theme for the year, for this year 2021. We know we're living in a very, very different year and in a very different environment. Church is not the same. Ministry will never be the same. But I believe God has placed a call in our lives and He is ministering to us and to you. And as a network of pastors, ministers, and churches, it is our desire that you as a young person, that you as a man, as a woman, as a young man, as a young woman, as a minister, as a pastor, as a leader in the church, would be part of what God is doing in the midst of it all. So this Engage Conference, I believe, will give us the opportunity for us to connect and to be able to understand what God is doing. And I want to share with you the thought of dream of the elders and vision for the generations. That's the thought that I want to share with you. Dream of the elders and vision for the generations. As we think of that and as we engage into that concept, there's a passage in the scripture in the book of Joel that gives us an opportunity to understand what God is doing with the idea of dream and vision. The book of Joel chapter 2 verse 28 and 29 reads as follows. And it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions. Even on the male and female servants, and in those days I will pour out my spirit. Now, as we think of that passage and as we think of the prophet Joel, he's talking to a generation of his time, but he's also speaking of the future generations. And it is part of our understanding and part of our embracing of what God is doing and what God will be doing in our network. We are the Central Pacific Ministry Network. We were the Northern Pacific Latin American District, but we're now identified as the Central Pacific Ministry Network. What is a network? But a connectedness, a means of coming together and sharing in unison what God has. And I believe that as we go through the process of understanding God's burden and God's call on us, sometimes, and maybe you are thinking, you know what, the call of God is to some people. Maybe I'm not ready or I'm not trained, I'm not qualified to serve God. I just want to be a lawyer, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a nurse, I want to pursue this career or that career. I want you to understand the ministry is co-vocational. I don't believe in bivocational. When you say bivocational, you're breaking and separating the spiritual from the secular. And I believe that we are doing the spiritual in the midst of the secular. That's why I call it co-vocational. So God is calling our generations. As you work as a lawyer, you are a minister of the gospel. As you work as a nurse, you are a minister of the gospel. As you work in the environment that you're in, you're doing ministry. And so I want you to understand that our leaders in the past found themselves in that situation, and the scripture talks about this call of God. Now, in the Old Testament, God called in an exclusive and very interesting way that was not open, but it was an exclusive and specific call. God called Noah to build an ark. God called Abraham to go to a land that God would show him with promises of the future. The one rescued from the waters, one Moses, was called to free the slave Hebrews and bring him out into freedom. And so on and so forth. That's a call in the Old Testament. It was specific and it was exclusive. It was not for everyone. But thanks be to God that as we come into the New Testament, we find an inclusive call and personal call. It's an inclusive. God includes everyone, and it is also a call that is personal. And as we see that, we find the call of God that becomes an invitation for young men and young women and older men and older women to hear God's call. Regardless of where you find yourself. You may find yourself at a moment where you say, I'm not ready. It's not about being ready, it's about being willing. And I want you to understand that Joel, he spoke the word. He gave God the time and his disposition so that God would use Joel at that time to speak for the generations that were coming. And what I find and what I see, not only in the scriptures, but what I see in history, is that the markings of history that we find become important to us. Because see, when God calls, the scripture says, and it tells us in Romans 11:29, that the call of God is irrevocable. And when you read that passage, it's a passage that we must understand that the word irrevocable is saying that God does not regret putting a mantle of a call on the individual. He doesn't take it back. He doesn't retract. He believes in you. Sometimes we don't believe in ourselves, but God believes in us. And in the midst of that call, in the midst of that irrevocable call that he places on us, he expects us to be able to invest in God and invest in ministry. Again, sometimes you think, well, I'm not going to be a pastor. I'm not going to be a missionary. I'm not going to be an evangelist. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the call that God has placed in your life and the invitation that he has given you. And those of us that are already in ministry, those of us that are already serving, maybe you're pastoring, maybe you're a minister, maybe you're doing work already in ministry for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. However long you have been serving God is not done yet. You continue and you must finish the race. Why? Because God placed a call on you. And what God has done, and I believe when we say dream of our elders, I'm talking about the fact that others came before us. And I love history. I like to look at history. I like to look at the history of the assemblies of God. I like to look at the history of the gospel. I like to look at the history of mankind. And we find that God is a God that believes in diversity and is a God that gives opportunities to many others. He's not exclusive. He has opened up opportunities for all. And as you make yourself available, as you make yourself accessible, God is going to use your life. And now more than ever, we need young men and young women to answer the call of God. Because that call that God has placed on us is a call that we believe, and I believe, is irrevocable, and it comes from God. What I find in the scriptures is the call of God. But see, we find men. We find people that God has called. And we have in our network, in our old network, we had a leader. He already finished the race, Felix Pozos. He was called of God to come forward and answer the call. I mean, he's already in the presence of God. He finished the race. He finished the work that God called him to do. Yet, I want you to think about this. He was young, just like you are. Before he ever completed his task of ministry, he was a young man, just like you and others. But that doesn't mean that he was ready to do everything he did in ministry. God took time to work in his life, but he made himself available. And as he advanced in years and as he gained experience, he did ministry effectively, but he had to get a start. Now, think about him. Now, he's the first that we call the first superintendent of our Northern Pacific Latin American district. Now, along with him, we find another young man that came along, and his name was Aaron Victorio. He answered the call of God. Now, he's just retired from ministry. He's beginning to kind of ease up on all the work of ministry that he has done all his life. But I want you to think about it. He was not ready to do all that he has done when he began. He was young, just like you, like I said. They began the race, they began to invest in ministry. He worked and did the ministry that God called them to do. Of course, he advanced, he achieved things. You know, these leaders became executive leaders in our network. That means that God took them to places they never thought of or they never planned for early on in their lives. And maybe you're watching, maybe you're listening. I want you to dream the dreams that they had, but also to begin to have vision of what God is going to do with you and the generations that come after you. Of course, he got married, his wife Jessie, and they done ministry together. But you know, we had another young man that came along in this team of executives, Lee Vaca. He was young. God called him. He did ministry. He responded to the call of God. He's also semi-retired. He's getting, you know, preaching, teaching. He's still doing ministry, but not the same as he did when he was younger. Who will come after these leaders? Who will continue to do ministry is something that we must engage on and commit to. He was an all-around champ in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He was a wrestler. Can you believe that? I mean, if you see him, talk to him about that. But he was young. He wanted to go to the university. He did get his BA. He did do some grad school. He did accomplish a lot. He pastored churches successfully. He served our district as a superintendent. What am I saying? I'm saying the dream of our elders, the dream of those that came before us. They work and follow and did ministry. But it was not all done. I mean, he was young again. He married. Some of you are thinking of getting married. Some of you maybe are not dating yet, but one day you will, and you're going to get married. You're going to have a family. That doesn't keep you from serving God. It rather challenges you to think about this. Dream and vision. It comes together. Somebody dreamed the dreams. Somebody has had the thoughts, but somebody has to execute them. Somebody has to come along and accomplish the work that has to be done. We are the Central Pacific Ministry Network. We are a body that has come together to do work of ministry. Think about what God is doing. He calls men and women to serve them. I want you to understand that it's not that you're ready. I'm not saying you're ready, but you must answer that call of God. Our network needs young men and young women to get trained and to enter ministry and to do ministry. Maybe you're at church right now. Maybe you're serving in some capacity. Maybe you think it's just, you know, you're teaching kids, you're teaching youth, you're working in the nursery, you're working, you know, with the ushers, you're working with the greeting committee. You're doing something at a very low level and you think it's not important. God is training you. Think about it. What would you be doing in 20 years? The year was 1998. We came together, and I say we because I was one of the young men that came together at that time. We gathered in San Jose, California. Our district covered the whole West Coast, the state of Alaska, Washington, Oregon, California, Nevada, Arizona, and Hawaii. All of these states were represented as Pacific Latin American district. We were expansive in the whole area, and we were doing ministry. Some of the men and women who served at that time have now gone to be with the Lord. We just had one passed away yesterday, Pastor Adrian Olivas. He served the Lord faithfully. He did his work. He finished the race. Who will fill their shoes? Who will fill their pulpits? That's what I'm talking to you about. We are looking at the future. We know we've been part of these dreams. Felix Pozos, the superintendent I just talked to you about, had a dream of seeing this whole West Coast become multiple districts. He talked about it. It was 10, even he mentioned 10 years before 1998. He sat at a kitchen table and wrote on a napkin the points that he wanted to present to the executive presbytery of the thoughts and the desires and the burning that God had placed in his heart. Little did they know, little did everybody else know, little did they understand that what God was doing with the life of these young men would fulfill a great call of God for the future of our district. But see, all of that was done, and God brought together that executive team, that founding team of Felix Pozos, Aaron Victorio, and Lee Baca. They were the three leaders God used at the beginning of our district. We went for 20 years. Fast forward 20 years. It was August the 9th through the 11th, 2018. We gathered in Rocklin, California, and we had gathered with an intent of beginning to identify what God was doing for us, and one of them was rebranding. We wanted to rebrand this district into a network. We presented these resolutions. The House approved them, and in August of 2018, we became the Central Pacific Ministry Network. As we begin to dream for the future, but begin to plant and establish a vision, I want you to know that it's important that we understand who we have been and who we need to become. And here's what I want you to understand. Historically, we were the Northern Pacific Latin American District. What did we do? Well, the way we function is we had what we call a superintendent, and we had the assistant superintendent, and we had the secretary treasurer. That was the three men I had mentioned, men who answered the call of God when they were young, and God has used them. But see, that structure was a hierarchical structure. So that there was the three executives who had a team of what we call the executive presbyters. They work right with them, alongside them. And then we had what we call the sectional presbyters. The sectional presbyters then work with what we call the local churches. They came along and did the work to impact the churches. That's how it worked. It came from the top down. It came from orders from the district. That's why people say the district says, because that was the mindset and that was the culture that we built, and that's how we operated. Our focus was primarily, at that time, we stayed focused on the idea of fundraising, event-driven, and we were conflict resolution focused. Those three things directed our district. It's not that it was wrong. It is what it is. It functioned that way, and it helped us for 20 years. But we can't continue to operate in the same way. We cannot continue to function in the same way. We have to make adjustments. And we have been talking, a vision for transformation began some 10 years ago, and now we have a restructuring committee. That restructuring committee has met for more than 4 years. And we have looked at, and we have prayed, and we have fasted, and we have sought consultants, and we have gone through the whole analysis. Everything is on the table. Everything is on the table. And we're talking about a shifting of structure, and a shifting of the way we do things, going from event-driven, conflict focus, and fundraising efforts to what we call now having the minister become the important part of our ministry. A healthy minister in a healthy church. But it all rises and falls with the minister. The minister is important. It plays a vital role in the whole structure of what we have. So what do we have to do? We have to understand that we have to have as a network, as a group, as a team of leaders, and as we have come together, we focus specifically in the need that we have to be able to say that we want to establish as part of our mission. We are looking at our mission as empowering ministers in churches to fulfill their local mission. See, it's not about the district. It's no longer a district, it's network. We work together. We want your success to be our success. So what do? We pursue what we call this mission as to empower our ministers and churches to fulfill their mission. And that leads us to the need of a vision. But who sets that? The minister, the pastor, the leader in the church, working with the local church and sets up a vision. And what is the vision? Healthy, effective, and relevant ministers that reproduce healthy, effective, and relevant ministries. That's what we're looking for. That's what we want to establish. And we want you to come along and help us and help us revitalize and relaunch, plant new churches, develop areas and ministries that are needed to be able to see growth. See, God saves people. There's salvations happening in the Bay Area, in Bakersfield, in Fresno, in the greater Sacramento area. Salvations are happening, and they happen in the same way. God saves them. But the structures and the methodologies that are used may not be the same that are being used in one area than the other. That's why we want to celebrate what you're doing if it's effective, relevant, and healthy for the local church. So how do we do that? Through the ministers, the pastors, the leaders. We want you to understand this structure because it's the way we want to move forward. Rather than a hierarchical, giving an order and everybody else following it, we want to know what God has placed in your heart and how God will lead your church forward. And we want to focus on healthy ministers in healthy churches. And what do? A healthy minister has healthy, effective, and relevant ministries in the local church. So that comes and functions and affects the local church. See, the minister is first, the health of the minister, and then is the health of the local church. And how are we going to work? Are we going to do away with the executives? No, of course not. We need them more than ever. We need the executive leadership because they will help us to be able to move this network forward and resource and develop and seek leadership development and church planting that will be focused and centered from there. And who do they work with? They work, of course, with the regional pastors. In the past, the mindset was administration. What we want to do is relational. So that's why there will be regional pastors. Just as the executives will no longer be superintendent or assistant superintendent, secretary, treasurer, now we have a lead pastor. We have an executive pastor that is the secretary treasurer. And we have an associate network pastor that is the assistant superintendent. So that's how we want to focus. So with regional pastors, we build relationships and nurture relationships to be able to have healthy pastors and healthy churches. And how do we then move forward in a form of the administrative part? How do we deal with the finances? We would have a network board that will be able to function and focus specifically on that. So it frees our presbyters, formal presbyters, now regional pastors to be able to build relationships and have healthy ministers and healthy churches. And how do that happens at the sectional level? What about the sectional presbyters? What we're suggesting is that we have facilitators, pastors that work in those areas as facilitators to nurture fellowship and relationships at the local level. We're not taking away power. We're empowering you because you need to be effective, relevant, healthy in that area of ministry that you are working on and that you are doing. I believe that God is calling us now more than ever. He's giving us an opportunity to understand that He has set you as a young person to be part of this great vision. Our leaders in the past, they dreamed of reaching out the Latino, but now it's not just the Latinos. Now is all people of all languages and all cultures. Our churches are reaching out all diverse communities, and God is asking you as a young person to step up, stand up, and answer the call. Why? Because the dream of our elders, must be the vision for the generations. The dream of our elders, the vision for our generations. And you and I, we have been called to do this work of ministry. I encourage you to answer the call. We will train you. We have the Center for Theological Studies where you can train and get ready to do ministry. I believe this is the time, and this Engage Conference is the moment where you and I, we can come together and understand that God has called us to work together, not just the young people alone on their own. We want to embrace you. We want you to embrace the mission and the vision of our network. We want to celebrate together what God has done. This is, after all, the Central Pacific Ministry Network, and you are part of it. We are together. God bless you.